The day a homeless Navy SEAL dug beneath an ancient cypress. His dog uncovered a secret powerful men would kill to hide. A homeless Navy SEAL returned to an abandoned ranch. His dog found a secret beneath a cypress tree. Ethan Calloway had lost everything. His wife, his home, and nearly his reason to keep going. Living from a battered pickup with only his loyal K9 Shadow beside him. He inherited a forgotten ranch deep in Colorado's mountains. But when Shadow began digging beneath an ancient cypress tree, they uncovered a secret buried for decades. One that would expose betrayal, reveal a grandfather's hidden legacy, and change Ethan's life forever. Comment 1 if you believe loyalty changes lives, or 0 if you justice does its way, and tell us where you're watching from. Snow drifted across the streets of downtown Denver like scraps of torn paper caught in the wind. The city moved around Ethan Calloway without noticing him. People hurried beneath glass office towers with coffee cups in their hands. Expensive SUVs rolled through intersections. Businessmen checked their phones. Tourists laughed beneath holiday lights, still hanging from the previous week. No one paid attention to the 62-year-old man, standing beside an aging pickup truck parked 3 blocks from a law office. That was fine with Ethan. Most days he preferred being invisible. The truck had once been blue. Years of Colorado winters had turned it into a patchwork of faded paint, rust, and repairs. The driver's side door groaned whenever it opened. A crack stretched across the windshield like a frozen lightning bolt. It was home, at least for now. Inside the truck sat a German shepherd. The dog's black and tan coat was beginning to gray around the muzzle. One ear carried a small notch from an injury years earlier. A faded military K9 vest rested across his broad chest. His name was Shadow. He watched the sidewalk with intelligent amber eyes. When Ethan appeared, Shadow immediately rose and pressed his nose against the glass. A faint smile touched Ethan's weathered face. Easy, partner. The dog's tail thumped once, only once. That was all Shadow ever needed. Ethan opened the door and scratched behind the shepherd's ears. For a moment the world became quiet. No lawyers, no relatives, no memories. Just a man and the dog who had saved his life more than once. Then Ethan straightened and looked toward the law office across the street. The smile disappeared. It was time. The offices of Hargrove and Pierce occupied the top floor of a polished granite building overlooking downtown Denver. Everything inside smelled expensive. Leather furniture, fresh coffee, wood polish. The kind of place where people discussed inheritances worth more than Ethan had earned. During his entire military career, a young receptionist directed him toward a conference room. Ethan walked slowly. His knees hurt in cold weather. Old injuries, old miles, old wars. Inside the conference room, his family was already gathered. His cousin Bradley sat at the head of the table, wearing a charcoal suit that probably cost more than Ethan's truck. Across from him sat Victoria and Shane, another pair of cousins who had spent the past decade expanding the family's business interests. Their clothes were perfect. Their smiles weren't. The attorney stood near a stack of folders. "Mr. Calloway," he said politely. Ethan nodded and took a seat near the end of the table. No one offered a greeting. No one asked how he was doing. No one asked where he had been living. No one mentioned the funeral. Walter Calloway had been dead for 3 weeks. Apparently that was enough time for grief to expire. The attorney cleared his throat. "As you know, we're here to finalize the distribution of Walter Calloway's estate." Folders opened, pens clicked, numbers appeared, properties, investments, commercial land, retirement accounts, timber leases, a ranch near Durango, several mountain cabins, business partnerships. The estate was larger than Ethan had expected, far larger. Walter had always lived modestly. Apparently, he had been wealthier than anyone realized. One by one, the assets were distributed. Bradley received commercial acreage. Victoria inherited investment properties. Shane took ownership of a profitable equipment company. Every few minutes another folder slid across the table. Another signature, another congratulation. Hours passed. Ethan remained silent. Eventually only one folder remained. The attorney hesitated. Then he picked it up. And finally, his voice changed slightly, almost apologetic. The Black Hollow Ranch property. Bradley laughed before the attorney even finished. A short, dismissive laugh. That place still exists? Victoria smirked. I thought it was condemned years ago. Shane leaned back in his chair. Nobody's been up there since the 90s. The attorney adjusted his glasses. The property consists of approximately 200 acres in the San Juan Mountains. 200 acres of weeds, Bradley said. A few people chuckled. Ethan remained expressionless. The attorney continued. There is a cabin on the property. A ruin, Bradley corrected. Some outbuildings. Collapsed. An access road. Barely. The room laughed again. Then the attorney looked directly at Ethan. Per Walter Calloway's instructions, Black Hollow Ranch transfers exclusively to Ethan Calloway. Silence followed. Then relief. Not from Ethan, from everyone else. Nobody wanted it. Bradley actually smiled. Well, there you go. He leaned forward. Looks like Grandpa left you something after all. More laughter. Ethan said nothing. The attorney slid the folder toward him. Inside was an old deed, yellowed papers, survey maps, a property description, and one additional item. An iron key, dark with age, heavy, ancient. Ethan picked it up. The metal felt cold. For some reason it reminded him of Walter, solid, quiet, uncomplicated. Bradley noticed. You know what's funny? Nobody answered. That never stopped Bradley. That ranch is probably worth less than the truck you're sleeping in. The words landed hard. Not because they were cruel, because they were true. No one in the room looked surprised, which meant they already knew. They knew about the truck. They knew Ethan was living out of it, and not one of them had cared. The silence stretched. Ethan slowly closed the folder, then he stood. The attorney looked uncomfortable. Mr. Calloway, it's fine. His voice remained calm, always calm. Years in the teams had taught him that. Never give anyone the satisfaction of seeing you bleed. Bradley shrugged. Victoria checked her phone. Shane signed another document. The meeting moved on, as if Ethan had already left. Maybe he had. A few minutes later, he stepped into the hallway, carrying the folder beneath one arm. The elevator ride felt longer than it should. By the time he reached the street, snow had begun falling harder. The city lights reflected off white flakes drifting through the air. Ethan stood there for a moment, watching, breathing, trying to ignore the familiar pressure building behind his ribs. Not anger, something heavier. The feeling that arrived whenever another door closed. Another connection disappeared. Another reminder that the world kept moving without him. A horn sounded somewhere down the street. A siren echoed in the distance. For a brief moment his mind betrayed him. The city vanished. Afghanistan appeared. Dust, smoke, gunfire, the smell of burning metal. Ethan squeezed his eyes shut. Not now, not here. A wet nose touched his hand. Shadow. The shepherd stood beside him, watching, waiting. Present. Always present. The flashback faded. Ethan exhaled slowly. Good timing, buddy. Shadow leaned against his leg. They stood there together beneath the falling snow. Two survivors. Two old soldiers. Neither saying a word. Eventually, Ethan opened the passenger door. Shadow climbed inside. Ethan followed. The heater rattled weakly when he started the engine. For a while, he simply sat there. The folder rested on the dashboard. The deed protruded from its edge. Black Hollow Ranch. The last thing nobody wanted. He almost laughed. Almost. Instead, he opened the folder again. The property map unfolded across the steering wheel. Mountain ridges, forest, streams, a winding dirt road, and at the center, a small circle marked near the cabin. Nothing more. Just an old survey symbol. Yet something about it caught his attention. Before he could study it further, Shadow suddenly stood. The dog moved forward until his nose nearly touched the paper. His ears rose, his body became rigid, focused, alert, not fearful, interested, very interested. Ethan frowned. What is it? Shadow stared at a specific point on the map, the center of the property, near that small circular marking. His tail stopped moving entirely. The old combat dog looked exactly the way he had before discovering something important during missions overseas. A scent, a clue, a threat, or a secret. Ethan looked from the dog to the map, then back again. For several long seconds, neither moved. Snow continued falling outside. Traffic passed. The city carried on. But inside the old truck, something had changed. For the first time all day, curiosity pushed aside sorrow. Black Hollow Ranch. An abandoned property nobody wanted. A ranch Walter had insisted on leaving specifically to him. And now Shadow was staring at it like it mattered. Very slowly, Ethan folded the map. All right, partner. Shadow's ears twitched. If Grandpa wanted me up there. Ethan looked west toward the distant mountains hidden beyond the city skyline. Maybe we should go see why. Outside, the snow fell harder, far beyond Denver, far beyond the highways and towns, deep inside the San Juan Mountains. An ancient cypress tree waited beneath the winter sky, and buried beneath its roots, a secret slept in silence, for now. The next morning, Denver disappeared behind Ethan Calloway, in a blur of gray buildings and falling snow. His pickup groaned as it climbed westward into the Rockies. The city faded quickly. Concrete became pine trees. Traffic became empty highway. Noise became distance. For the first time in months, Ethan felt as though he was moving towards something, instead of simply running out of places to go. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat. The old German shepherd rarely slept during long drives. He preferred to watch, always watching, always alert. Years of military training never truly left either of them. The interstate stretched ahead beneath a pale winter sky. Snow-covered peaks rose in the distance, like enormous white walls guarding another world. Ethan gripped the steering wheel with both hands. His knuckles were scarred. So was nearly every other part of him. Physical scars were easy to explain. The others weren't. The mountains reminded him of Afghanistan. Not because they looked the same. They didn't. Colorado was cleaner, softer, more forgiving. But mountain roads always triggered memories. The kind that arrived without permission. The kind that refused to stay buried. He glanced into the rearview mirror. For a moment he wasn't seeing the highway. He was seeing dust, heat, a convoy winding through a narrow valley. The year was 2011. The sound of gunfire exploded somewhere inside his memory. A sudden crack, then another, then chaos. His heartbeat accelerated. The steering wheel felt different beneath his hands. Sweat formed despite the cold. Not now. Not here. Not again. The flashback pushed harder. He remembered the vehicle in front of him erupting into smoke. The radio screaming. Men shouting. The smell. God, he still remembered the smell. Then another memory forced its way forward. A black and tan German shepherd leaping through dust. Searching. Warning. Saving lives. Shadow. Ethan blinked. The highway returned. Snow returned. Colorado returned. A wet nose touched his elbow. Shadow. The dog had moved closer without Ethan noticing. His amber eyes studied Ethan carefully. Concerned, focused, present. Ethan released a slow breath. I'm good, buddy. Shadow continued watching him. The shepherd clearly disagreed. A small smile appeared despite everything. You always know. The dog's tail tapped against the seat. Once. The mountains grew larger as the day passed. Hours slipped by. The truck climbed higher. Roads narrowed. Small towns appeared and vanished. Gas stations stood alone against endless stretches of wilderness. Ranches dotted distant valleys. Frozen rivers glittered beneath the winter sun. By early afternoon, Ethan's stomach reminded him he hadn't eaten since the previous evening. A faded sign appeared beside the highway. Mabel's diner next exit the building. Looked like it had survived every decade since the 1950s, which probably meant the food was good. Places that lasted that long usually were. Ethan pulled into the gravel parking lot. The truck rattled to a stop. Shadow immediately stood. "You too." The shepherd's ears perked. Together they crossed the lot. A bell jingled when Ethan opened the door. Warm air rushed out. The smell of coffee, bacon, and homemade pie filled the room. For a second, Ethan simply stood there. He hadn't smelled a real diner in months, not one like this. The kind with worn booths, friendly waitresses, old photographs hanging on wood-paneled walls. The kind of place where people still knew each other's names. Several customers looked up. Then their attention settled on Shadow. Military dogs always attracted attention. The shepherd carried himself differently. People sensed it. An elderly waitress approached with a menu tucked beneath one arm. Her silver hair was tied into a loose bun. Her name tag read Mabel. Apparently, she owned the place. "Well now," she said. Her eyes immediately settled on Shadow's vest. "You two look like you've traveled a ways." Ethan nodded. "Heading into the mountains." Mabel smiled. "Military dog, retired." The woman crouched slightly. Shadow sniffed her hand. "Approved." That seemed good enough for her. "Beautiful animal. He saved my life." The words came out before Ethan could stop them. Mabel looked up. Something changed in her eyes. Recognition. Not of Ethan. Of sacrifice. "My husband served in Vietnam," she said softly. "He used to talk about the dogs." Shadow sat beside Ethan. Perfect posture, perfect discipline. Even now, years after retirement, years after combat, the old shepherd still behaved as though he were on duty. Mabel led them to a booth near the window. Outside, snow drifted across the parking lot. Inside, warmth wrapped around the room. For a little while, the world felt normal. Ethan ordered coffee and a plate of eggs, toast, and sausage. Nothing fancy, just food. The kind of meal that reminded him of easier days. While waiting, he unfolded the property map again. The old paper spread across the table. Black Hollow Ranch. The name still sounded strange. The deed listed 200 acres, mountain streams, timber, a cabin, several structures, most likely all falling apart. Ethan studied the markings. His eyes drifted once again toward the small circle near the center of the property. The same place Shadow had stared at the night before. Strange. Very strange. Shadow noticed it too. The shepherd immediately leaned forward. His nose hovered above that exact location. Ethan frowned. "What is it?" Shadow remained focused. Mabel returned carrying coffee. She noticed the map. "Buying land?" "Not exactly," Ethan explained briefly. "The inheritance, the abandoned ranch, the relatives, the old key." Mabel listened quietly. When he finished, she shook her head. "People are funny." "How's that?" "They spend their whole lives chasing value." She poured more coffee. "Then miss the things that actually matter." Ethan wasn't sure how to answer. The waitress smiled. "You know what I've learned?" "What?" "The things everybody ignores usually turn out to be important." Her words lingered after she walked away. Hours later, Ethan would remember them. For reasons he couldn't yet understand. The meal arrived. It was excellent, simple, honest, the way food should be. When Ethan asked for the check, Mabel waved him off. "It's already taken care of." Ethan frowned. "By who?" The waitress smiled. "Me." "No, yes. Mabel," she pointed toward Shadow. "Military dogs don't buy their own lunch." Ethan stared at her. For a moment, he couldn't speak. Kindness felt unfamiliar these days. Almost uncomfortable. Mabel placed a hand on his shoulder. "Whatever's waiting for you up there in those mountains." She nodded toward the window. "I hope it's something good." Ethan looked at Shadow. Then back at the waitress. "Me too." Outside, the sky had begun to clear. Sunlight broke through clouds and painted the distant mountains gold. The truck rolled back onto the highway. Miles passed, then more. The Rockies gradually gave way to the rugged wilderness of southern Colorado. The terrain became harsher, more isolated, more beautiful. Snow-covered ridges stretched endlessly across the horizon. Dark forests filled deep valleys. Frozen rivers carved silver lines through the landscape. Civilization felt very far away. As afternoon faded toward evening, Ethan's thoughts drifted once more, this time not to combat, to his wife, Claire. Even after 3 years, thinking her name still hurt. She had been the one person capable of reaching places inside him that no one else could. She had understood the nightmares, the silence, the panic attacks, the bad days, especially the bad days. When cancer took her, something inside Ethan had gone with her. The house followed, then the savings, then the future he thought they would share. Eventually, only Shadow remained. The old dog slept now. His head rested against the passenger seat. Gray hairs covered his muzzle. His breathing was slow, peaceful. Ethan smiled sadly. "You stuck around." Shadow opened one eye, as if to say, "Of course I did." The sun began sinking behind distant peaks. Golden light spilled across the highway. Long shadows stretched over snow-covered fields. Then something unexpected happened. Shadow suddenly sat upright, alert, instantly. The same way he had in Denver, the same way he had at the diner. His ears rose, his eyes locked forward, focused, intent. Ethan looked ahead, far in the distance, barely visible through the fading light. A wooden sign stood beside a narrow mountain road. Black Hollow Road 15 miles. Shadow stared at it, unblinking. The old shepherd's body became completely still. Every instinct inside him seemed activated, waiting, listening, expecting. Ethan felt a strange chill, not fear, something else. The feeling that a door was beginning to open. The feeling that, after years of drifting, some invisible current was finally pulling him somewhere specific, toward something, toward an answer, toward a secret. The truck turned onto the narrow mountain road. Snow crunched beneath the tires. Pine forests closed around them. Darkness gathered beneath the trees. And far ahead, hidden among mountains that had watched over the land, for generations, Black Hollow Ranch waited. So did the ancient Cypress Tree. And whatever had captured Shadow's attention long before Ethan understood why. The mountain road narrowed as darkness settled across the San Juan Mountains. The truck's headlights cut through drifting snow and towering walls of pine. For miles, there was nothing. No houses. No gas stations, no signs of civilization, only wilderness. The deeper Ethan drove, the more it felt like he was leaving the modern world behind. Black Hollow Road twisted through valleys and climbed along steep ridges. Snow-covered branches hung over the road like silent sentries. The forest seemed endless. Shadow never looked away from the windshield. Every muscle in his body remained alert, waiting, watching. The old shepherd looked less like a retired dog, and more like the military canine he had once been. That alone made Ethan uneasy. The dog trusted his instincts, and Ethan trusted Shadow's. The last mile was the worst. The road had deteriorated into a rough trail, carved through the mountains decades ago, and forgotten by time. Deep ruts forced the truck to crawl forward. The suspension groaned. Ice cracked beneath the tires. Then suddenly the trees opened. Ethan stopped the truck. For a moment neither he nor Shadow moved. Black Hollow Ranch stretched before them. The property looked exactly like something nobody wanted. A weather-beaten wooden gate leaned crookedly between 2 stone posts. Large sections of fencing had collapsed years ago and disappeared beneath snowdrifts. A narrow dirt lane wound through open fields choked by brush and dormant grass. Farther back stood a cabin, or what remained of one. The roof sagged noticeably on one side. Several windows were boarded. The front porch tilted downward. Time had not been kind. Beyond the cabin rose dark mountain ridges that seemed to swallow the horizon. The place felt forgotten, abandoned, alone, and yet something felt wrong, not dangerous, not exactly, just wrong. Shadow suddenly pushed against the truck door. Ethan opened it. The shepherd jumped out immediately. His paws landed in fresh snow. Instead of running toward the cabin, he turned his head, locked onto something. Ethan followed his gaze. There, near the center of the property, standing alone against the fading twilight, the cypress tree. It was enormous, far larger than Ethan had imagined. The trunk looked ancient, thick enough that 3 grown men couldn't have wrapped their arms around it. Its massive branches stretched outward like dark arms against the winter sky. Snow rested on its limbs. The tree seemed older than the ranch, older than the mountains, older than memory. Shadow stared at it without blinking, then slowly began walking toward it. "Easy, partner." The shepherd ignored him, not completely, but enough to be unusual. Shadow approached within 30 yards of the tree, then stopped. The dog stood perfectly still, listening, studying, almost as if he expected something to happen. A cold breeze swept across the field. The branches moved slightly, nothing else. Eventually, Shadow turned back. Yet even as he returned, his eyes kept drifting toward the cypress. Ethan didn't understand. Not yet. But the behavior unsettled him. The dog had noticed something. That much was obvious. The question was what? By the time Ethan reached the cabin, darkness had fully arrived. The front door hung slightly crooked. He used the old iron key from Walter's folder. To his surprise, the lock still worked. The mechanism resisted at first, then clicked. The sound echoed through the silence. The door creaked open. A blast of cold air greeted him. Dust, old wood, a faint scent of pine. The beam from his flashlight swept across the interior. The cabin was small. 1 main room, a stone fireplace, a kitchen area, a staircase leading upward, furniture covered with white sheets. Nothing remarkable, nothing valuable, nothing worth fighting over. At least that's what it looked like. Shadow entered cautiously. His ears remained raised. The dog moved from room to room, checking corners, checking windows, checking doors, performing the same security sweep he had conducted hundreds of times overseas. Only after several minutes did he relax slightly. Ethan set down his duffel bag. The cabin wasn't comfortable, but it was dry. For the first time in months, he had a roof over his head. That counted for something. He lit a lantern he found hanging near the fireplace. Warm yellow light filled the room. The cabin immediately felt less abandoned, less lonely. For a while, Ethan focused on practical tasks, building a fire, unpacking supplies, preparing food, simple actions, the kind that kept memories at a distance. Outside, snow continued falling. The mountains disappeared into darkness. Inside, flames crackled softly. Shadow stretched near the fireplace. For the first time all day, the old shepherd appeared tired. Ethan opened a can of stew and heated it over the fire. The smell filled the room. Not exactly gourmet, but warm, comforting, human. For a brief moment, peace settled over Black Hollow Ranch. Then Shadow growled. Low, deep, instant. Ethan immediately froze. The growl lasted only a second, but it was enough. Years of training snapped into place. The former seal reached for the flashlight. Shadow stood, his eyes fixed on the front window. The dog wasn't barking. That made it worse. Shadow barked when he wanted attention. He growled when something was wrong. Ethan moved carefully toward the glass. Outside, darkness swallowed most of the property. Snow reflected faint moonlight. The cypress stood motionless in the distance. Everything looked normal. Too normal. The growling stopped. Shadow relaxed slightly. Yet he continued staring, watching. Ethan remained at the window another minute. Nothing moved. Eventually, he stepped away. Probably wildlife. Shadow didn't seem convinced. Neither was Ethan. Hours later, after the fire burned lower, Ethan climbed the narrow staircase to the loft. The old bed creaked beneath his weight. Shadow settled on the floor nearby. The arrangement felt familiar. The same one they had followed for years. Ethan slept above. Shadow guarded below. Outside, the wind moved through the trees. The sound reminded Ethan of distant ocean waves. For a while, he thought he might actually sleep. Then something woke him. A sound. Faint, barely audible. His eyes opened immediately. Years of military service had trained him to wake fast. He listened. Silence. Then another sound. Not inside the cabin. Outside a vehicle, far away. Very far away, but unmistakable. An engine. Ethan sat upright. Shadow was already awake. The shepherd stood rigidly near the window. listening. The engine noise lasted only a few seconds, then disappeared. The mountains fell silent again. Ethan frowned. Nobody should have been out here. Not at this hour. Not in this weather. He climbed from bed and moved to the window. Nothing. Only darkness. Only snow. Only the ancient cypress standing beneath the moonlight. Eventually, the silence returned completely. No headlights. No engine. No movement. Yet something about the moment lingered. A feeling. A question. Who would be driving through these mountains in the middle of the night? And why? The next morning arrived cold and brilliant. Sunlight spilled across fresh snow. The mountains glowed gold. For a few minutes, Black Hollow Ranch looked almost beautiful. Ethan stepped outside, holding a cup of coffee. The air bit at his lungs. Shadow immediately headed toward the cypress. Again, the exact same path. The exact same destination. The exact same focus. The dog reached the tree, stopped, looked down, sniffed, then slowly circled the trunk. Once, twice, 3 times, studying something Ethan couldn't see. Then he sat, facing the tree, waiting. The behavior made no sense. And yet Shadow was not a dog given to pointless actions. Not ever. Ethan looked around the property. Morning light revealed details hidden by darkness. The ranch was in worse condition than he thought. But something else caught his attention. A trail of footprints. Fresh footprints. Near the cabin, his pulse quickened. The prints weren't his, and they certainly weren't Shadow's. Someone had walked here recently, very recently. The snow inside the tracks remained crisp and undisturbed. Perhaps only a day old, maybe less. Ethan followed them several yards. Then they disappeared beneath harder ground. He stood there staring. A cold breeze moved across the valley. The cypress tree swayed gently. Shadow remained beneath it, watching, waiting. And suddenly Ethan understood one thing with complete certainty. Black Hollow Ranch was not as abandoned as everyone believed. Someone had been here. Someone had been watching. And whatever had drawn Shadow to that ancient tree was connected to the mystery. Somewhere beneath the silence of Black Hollow Ranch, answers were waiting. And Ethan had the uneasy feeling they were about to find him. The footprints bothered him all morning. Not because they proved someone had been there. They proved someone had been there recently. Snow had fallen heavily 2 nights before. The tracks were too sharp, too clean, too fresh. Whoever had walked near the cabin had done so within the last 24 hours. Maybe less. Ethan crouched beside the prints. Years in the teams had taught him to observe details. The tread pattern appeared modern. Work boots, large size, probably a man. The tracks approached the cabin, circled it, then disappeared toward the trees. No attempt to hide them, no obvious purpose. Just enough evidence to raise questions. Shadow stood nearby. The shepherd's attention wasn't on the footprints. It remained fixed on the cypress tree. Again, always the tree. The massive trunk stood silent beneath the winter sun. Ancient, patient, watching. Ethan straightened and glanced toward it. "You're obsessed with that thing." Shadow flicked an ear. The dog offered no explanation. By noon, Ethan decided to inspect the cabin more thoroughly. If someone had been visiting Black Hollow Ranch, there had to be signs. The building contained more rooms than he had initially realized. Storage spaces, closets, a cellar entrance beneath the staircase. The place had clearly been larger in its prime. Dust covered most surfaces. Spiderwebs hung from corners, yet certain details felt strangely out of place. Ethan noticed the first one in the kitchen, a lantern. Nothing unusual about that, except for the oil. He picked it up. The reservoir felt heavy. Full, recently filled, he removed the cap. The scent of fresh lamp oil drifted upward. Not old, not stale, fresh, very fresh. Ethan frowned. Nobody filled lanterns in abandoned cabins, not after decades. He set it down carefully, then continued searching. The second discovery came inside a pantry. Behind several old cans sat a cardboard box. Inside were batteries, still packaged. Manufacturing date, 8 months earlier. Ethan stared. The batteries didn't belong here, neither did the lantern oil. His pulse quickened slightly. The feeling that someone had been maintaining the property grew stronger. Room by room, the evidence accumulated. A broom with clean bristles, a recently repaired window latch, nails that looked newer than everything around them. Small details, easy to miss, impossible to ignore once seen. By afternoon, Ethan sat at the kitchen table, staring at a growing list of questions. Shadow lay near the front door, but even while resting, the dog's ears remained alert, listening, waiting. Outside, clouds gathered over the mountains. The sunlight began fading. The temperature dropped rapidly. Winter returned quickly at higher elevations. Ethan decided to explore the upstairs loft more carefully. There had to be answers somewhere. Walter had owned this property for decades. If anyone understood its secrets, it would be him. The loft contained old furniture covered by sheets, trunks, boxes, family belongings forgotten by time. Dust swirled through beams of fading sunlight as Ethan searched. Most items held little value. Photographs, books, old tools, letters. Then he found something strange, a wooden chest hidden beneath a stack of blankets, locked. The brass latch had long since corroded. A few minutes with a screwdriver opened it. Inside sat dozens of photographs. Most were black and white. Ethan began sorting through them. His grandfather appeared in nearly all of them. A younger Walter, stronger, standing beside ranch buildings, trucks, groups of men. Then Ethan froze. One photograph didn't belong. The image showed Walter standing beside 3 unfamiliar men. All wore suits, government-looking suits. One man carried a military bearing Ethan recognized instantly. Another appeared to be armed. The background wasn't a ranch. It looked like an airfield. Or perhaps a military facility. Ethan turned the photograph over. No date, no names, nothing. Only a single handwritten note. WC. Project meeting. Project meeting. What project? Walter had always presented himself as nothing more than a rancher. A stubborn old rancher, nothing else. Yet this photograph suggested a different story. A story Ethan had never heard. He continued searching. More photographs emerged. More unfamiliar faces. Several showed Walter standing beside government vehicles. Others showed him near maps spread across tables. One even appeared to include military officers. The deeper Ethan dug, the stranger everything became. Shadow suddenly growled. The sound echoed through the loft. Ethan immediately looked up. The shepherd stood near the window, rigid, focused, looking outside again. Ethan crossed the room. The view overlooked the northern edge of the property. Dense forest stretched toward distant mountains. Nothing moved. Nothing obvious. Yet Shadow remained tense. Then Ethan saw it. Far away, a flash, tiny, almost invisible, a reflection, like sunlight bouncing off glass. Gone instantly. He blinked. Had he imagined it? Maybe. Maybe not. The flash never returned. But Shadow continued watching. The old shepherd trusted his instincts. Ethan trusted Shadow's. That evening, the weather worsened. Dark clouds swallowed the sky. Wind swept through the valley. The cypress tree swayed against the growing storm. Inside the cabin, Ethan lit the lantern, the fresh lantern, the one that shouldn't have existed. Its warm glow filled the room. He sat beside the fireplace, studying the photographs again. Walter, government officials, military personnel, secret meetings. Nothing made sense. Then something else caught his eye. One photograph contained the cypress tree, much younger, smaller, yet unmistakably the same tree. Walter stood beside it. Behind him was another man. The image had faded badly, but one detail remained visible. The second man wore a military uniform, not modern, old, very old. Cold War era, perhaps. Ethan turned the picture over. Again there was handwriting. Only 3 words. Keep it safe. A chill moved through him. Keep what safe? The tree? The ranch? Something hidden? Questions multiplied faster than answers. The wind struck the cabin harder. Branches scraped across the roof. The mountains darkened. Shadow rose and paced toward the front window. Again, always the window, always watching. Ethan followed. Outside, twilight settled over Black Hollow Ranch. Snow began falling. The cypress stood black against the fading sky. The property looked isolated, forgotten. Yet Ethan no longer believed that. Someone had maintained this place. Someone had filled the lantern, replaced batteries, repaired windows, and perhaps watched the ranch from afar. Then another movement caught his eye. Very distant, near the ridgeline, two tiny lights appeared, headlights. Ethan froze. The lights moved slowly between trees. A vehicle far away, yet clearly visible. The headlights stopped. For several seconds they remained motionless, facing the ranch, facing him. Then they disappeared. Not by turning around, not by driving away, simply gone, as though the vehicle had descended behind the ridge. Shadow growled again. Low, warning, the same sound he'd made before. Ethan felt the hairs on the back of his neck rise. The timing was impossible to ignore. Someone visits the ranch, someone maintains it, someone watches from the mountains. And Walter's photographs suggest a secret life nobody knew about. The pieces were beginning to connect, but not in a way Ethan understood. Night fully arrived. The storm intensified. Snow hammered the windows. The forest vanished into darkness. Inside the cabin, Ethan secured the doors and checked every window. Old habits, military habits, the kind that never leave. Shadow settled near the entrance, guard position, watching, waiting. The fire crackled softly. Outside, the wind howled through the trees. Inside, Ethan spread Walter's photographs across the table. The lantern illuminated faces frozen in time. Government men, military men, Walter, the Cypress Tree, and that message, keep it safe. Hours passed. The storm grew stronger. Ethan should have felt exhausted. Instead, he felt awake, focused, drawn deeper into the mystery. Somewhere inside Black Hollow Ranch lay the reason Walter had spent decades returning here. The reason strangers still visited. The reason Shadow couldn't stop staring at the cypress. And perhaps the reason someone had been watching the ranch from the mountains. The fire popped loudly. Shadow's head lifted instantly. The dog stared toward the darkness beyond the front door, completely still, listening. Ethan followed his gaze. Nothing. Yet the feeling remained. The feeling that they were no longer alone, and somewhere beyond the storm, hidden among the pines and snow, someone else was listening too. The storm raged through the night. Wind hammered the cabin walls. Snow piled against the porch. Branches scraped across the roof like fingernails against old wood. Ethan slept little. Years of military service had taught him how to rest without truly sleeping. Every unfamiliar sound pulled him awake. Every creak, every gust, every shift in the storm. And every time he opened his eyes, Shadow was already awake, watching, guarding, listening. By dawn, the worst of the weather had passed. A pale winter sun pushed through broken clouds. The mountains emerged once more from beneath curtains of blowing snow. The world outside looked untouched, clean white, silent, but Ethan knew better. Silence often hid things. The same way calm water could hide dangerous currents beneath the surface. He brewed coffee over the stove and spread Walter's photographs across the table again. The image of his grandfather standing beside government officials refused to leave his mind. Who had Walter really been? For 62 years, Ethan had believed he knew the answer. A rancher, a stubborn old man, a widower who preferred mountains to cities. Nothing more. Now that certainty was beginning to crack. Shadow finished his breakfast and immediately moved toward the staircase. Then stopped, looked back, waiting. Ethan frowned. What is it? The shepherd turned and climbed the stairs, slowly, deliberately, then disappeared into the loft. Ethan followed. The dog led him toward the far corner where old shelves lined the wall. The same corner Ethan had searched the day before. Shadow sniffed along the floor, then nudged something with his nose, a bookshelf. At first glance it looked ordinary, dusty, heavy, fixed in place, but the dog continued nudging it, persistent, focused. Ethan knelt beside it. The floor beneath seemed slightly uneven. A narrow gap separated the shelf from the wall. Almost invisible, he pushed. Nothing. He pushed harder. The shelf shifted, only an inch, but enough. Dust fell from the top. Wood groaned, and suddenly Ethan saw it. A compartment hidden behind the shelves. His pulse quickened. The space contained a narrow wooden box sealed behind decades of dust. Walter had hidden it carefully. Not from thieves. From time. Ethan lifted the box and carried it downstairs. Shadow followed closely. The old shepherd's tail moved once, as if he already knew they were getting closer. The lid opened with a squeak. Inside sat 6 leather-bound journals. Their covers were worn, edges frayed, pages yellowed, yet they had been protected, preserved, waiting. Each journal bore a year. Ethan picked up the oldest one. Walter's handwriting filled every page, strong, neat, precise. The first entries discussed ranch maintenance, fences, weather, livestock, normal things. Then the tone changed, gradually, subtly, until certain passages stood out. March 1983 returned to the tree today. Everything remains secure. July 1987, survey team confirmed the numbers. Bigger than we feared. October 1991. Another inquiry from outsiders. Refused. Must protect it. Ethan sat back. Protect what? Every few pages the same references appeared. The tree, the property, protection, watchfulness, secrecy. One journal contained dozens of entries documenting monthly trips to Black Hollow Ranch. Not yearly, not occasionally, monthly, for decades. Walter had come here constantly, even into old age, as though tending something important, something valuable, something hidden. Hours passed as Ethan read. Outside, sunlight slowly crossed the snow-covered valley. Inside, Walter's journals began revealing another life. A life Ethan had never known existed. Then he found a passage that made him stop breathing. May 1998. Met with former agency contacts in Durango. They remain concerned about corporate interest. Agreed to continue monitoring activity. The reserve must remain protected. Agency contacts? What agency? The entry offered no explanation. Another journal provided slightly more. February 2007. Military assessment completed. The reserve exceeds all projections. Good news for the future. Bad news if the wrong people discover it. Reserve, again. The word appeared repeatedly. Always paired with warnings. Always linked to the ranch. Always connected to the cypress tree. Ethan looked toward the window. The giant tree stood visible in the distance. Silent, patient, as though it knew something. As though it had always known. By afternoon, Ethan needed answers from someone still living. The journals mentioned Durango several times. The nearest town lay nearly an hour away. He packed several photographs and drove down the mountain. Shadow came too. Of course he did. The road wound through forests and frozen valleys. Eventually civilization returned. Gas stations, hardware stores, small businesses, people. Durango wasn't large, but after days of isolation it felt almost crowded. The town sat beneath snow-covered mountains, its historic buildings lined along streets, decorated with winter lights. Ethan stopped first at a diner. Locals often knew more than official records. Years in the military had taught him that. The waitress recognized the photographs immediately. "That's Walter Calloway." Ethan nodded. "You knew him?" Everybody knew Walter, she smiled. He came through town every month, again. The pattern continued. "What did he do here?" The waitress shrugged. Nobody knew exactly. He'd buy supplies, sometimes meet people, then head back into the mountains. What people? I don't know. She paused. Mostly older men. Government-looking types. Government-looking types. The phrase echoed the photographs. A puzzle slowly taking shape. Several hours later, Ethan visited the county records office. Most employees were eager to help. Walter had apparently been respected throughout the region. One clerk remembered him well. Old Walter, the woman smiled. Nicest man you'd ever meet. Did he ever mention Black Hollow Ranch? Her smile faded slightly. Only once. Ethan leaned forward. What did he say? The clerk thought carefully, then answered. He said some things are worth protecting, even when nobody understands why. The statement lingered. Walter had repeated the same idea throughout the journals. Protecting, watching, waiting, always waiting. As Ethan prepared to leave town, another development occurred. A black luxury SUV pulled into the parking lot outside the records office. Expensive, new, out of place. A tall man stepped out, mid-50s, perfect coat, perfect haircut, perfect smile. The kind of smile that felt practiced, not genuine. The man approached confidently. Mr. Calloway? Ethan immediately became cautious. Who's asking? The man extended a hand. Garrett Voss. Ethan didn't take it. Garrett withdrew his hand without losing the smile. I own Voss Development. The name meant nothing to Ethan. Apparently, Garrett noticed. We specialize in land acquisitions throughout Colorado. Now the smile made sense. A businessman. The dangerous kind. What do you want? Garrett glanced toward the mountains. Black Hollow Ranch. The answer came too quickly, too directly, as if he'd rehearsed it. Ethan's instincts sharpened. How do you know I own it? Small towns. Garrett laughed softly. News travels. Shadow stepped forward, not growling, not threatening, just watching. Garrett noticed. For the first time, his confidence slipped slightly. Beautiful dog. Ethan remained silent. Garrett adjusted his coat. Look, I'll be honest. That property isn't practical. Difficult access, harsh winters, expensive maintenance. Then came the real point. I'd be interested in making you an offer. Ethan folded his arms. I arrived 3 days ago. Yes. The answer came immediately, too immediately. Garrett smiled again. Like I said, news travels. Something felt wrong, very wrong. The man knew too much, too quickly, and his interest seemed unusually strong for a neglected ranch nobody wanted. What kind of offer? Garrett named a figure. It sounded large, much larger than Ethan expected, which made him trust it even less. Nobody overpaid for worthless land. Nobody. Ethan shook his head. I'm not selling. Garrett's smile remained, but his eyes changed, just slightly. A flash of disappointment. Then calculation. As you wish. He handed Ethan a business card. If you change your mind. Ethan took it. Only because refusing would reveal too much. Garrett nodded politely, then returned to the SUV. Moments later, he was gone. Shadow watched the vehicle disappear. The shepherd's ears remained raised long afterward. Ethan looked at the card, then toward the mountains, then toward Walter's journals inside his truck. For decades, Walter had protected something. Now, a powerful businessman wanted the property badly enough to approach him almost immediately. That wasn't coincidence. As the sun began setting, Ethan drove back toward Black Hollow Ranch. The mountains glowed orange beneath the fading light. Snow sparkled across the valleys. The cypress tree waited in the distance, silent, watching. And for the first time, Ethan understood that whatever Walter had spent decades protecting wasn't just valuable. Someone else wanted it too. The drive back to Black Hollow Ranch felt different. The mountains hadn't changed. The snow still covered the valleys. The pine forests still stretched endlessly toward the horizon. But now every shadow seemed to contain a question. Every distant ridgeline felt like it might be hiding a pair of eyes. Garrett Voss's smile stayed with Ethan the entire drive, not because it was threatening, because it was calculated. The kind of smile worn by people who already know more than they're willing to admit. By the time Ethan reached the ranch, the winter sun was dropping behind the mountains. Long shadows covered the property. The ancient cypress stood dark against the glowing sky, waiting, watching. Shadow jumped from the truck before Ethan could open the door completely. The old shepherd immediately headed toward the tree. Again, always the tree. The dog reached the massive trunk and began circling it slowly. Nose low, ears alert, studying, searching. The same behavior repeated every day. The same pattern. The same destination. Ethan watched for several minutes, then finally walked over. What do you know that I don't? Shadow glanced at him briefly. then returned to sniffing the frozen ground. The answer remained hidden. For now, the evening grew colder. Dark clouds gathered beyond the western peaks. A storm was coming, a bad one. Years in the mountains had taught Ethan how to recognize the signs. The wind shifted. The temperature dropped sharply. The birds disappeared. Even the forest seemed to hold its breath. Inside the cabin, Ethan stacked extra firewood near the fireplace and reinforced one of the loose window shutters. By 8 o'clock, snow had begun falling. By 9, the storm had arrived. Wind slammed against the cabin. The roof groaned. Branches scraped violently against the walls. The entire structure trembled beneath the assault. Shadow remained awake, watching, listening. The shepherd had abandoned his usual spot near the door and positioned himself beside Ethan's chair. Close, protective. Ethan noticed immediately. Shadow only behaved that way when he sensed something was wrong, outside, or inside Ethan himself. Unfortunately, tonight it was both. The thunder began shortly after 10. A deep boom rolled through the mountains, then another and another. The sound hit Ethan harder than he expected. His body stiffened instantly. His pulse accelerated. His breathing changed. The cabin disappeared. The storm disappeared. The mountains disappeared. Suddenly he was somewhere else, somewhere far away. A different night, a different storm, Afghanistan. The memory struck without warning. An explosion, radio chatter, shouting, dust, fire. The violent crack of incoming mortar rounds. Ethan closed his eyes. Not now, please not now. But Pete's deed didn't negotiate. It arrived when it wanted. The thunder outside became artillery inside his mind. Every flash of lightning became battlefield illumination. Every vibration in the cabin became another explosion. His chest tightened. His hands trembled. He knew what was happening. That almost made it worse. Because he couldn't stop it. Shadow immediately moved closer. The old shepherd pressed his body against Ethan's leg. Solid, warm, real, a living anchor. The dog had done this before many times over many years. Whenever the nightmares came. Whenever the memories returned. Whenever Ethan began slipping backward into places he didn't want to revisit. Shadow always brought him home. The shepherd rested his head against Ethan's knee, breathing steadily, calmly, patiently. Ethan placed a trembling hand on the dog's neck, focused on the fur, the warmth, the reality. One breath, then another. Slowly the flashback loosened its grip. The cabin returned. The fire returned. The storm returned. Colorado returned. Ethan exhaled heavily. Thanks, buddy. Shadow's tail moved once. Then lightning struck somewhere nearby. A brilliant flash filled the cabin. Thunder exploded almost immediately afterward. The roof shuddered. A loud cracking sound echoed outside. Something large had fallen. A tree, perhaps. Then Shadow sprang to his feet. Instantly. Every muscle locked, the dog's ears rose, his eyes fixed on the front door. Not fear, alertness. Pure alertness. Ethan noticed immediately. The shepherd wasn't reacting to the storm. He was reacting to something else. Something outside. Shadow growled, then barked. One sharp bark. The first Ethan had heard since arriving at the ranch. The old dog spun toward the door. Another bark, louder, urgent. Then he bolted. Straight toward the entrance. Ethan stood. What is it? Shadow barked again. The sound echoed through the cabin. The dog wasn't asking. He was telling. Something was wrong. Ethan grabbed his flashlight and jacket. The moment he opened the door, the storm hit him like a wall. Snow swirled sideways. Wind howled through the darkness. Visibility dropped to almost nothing. Yet Shadow had already disappeared into the storm, running, fast. Toward the cypress tree. Ethan. The command meant nothing. The shepherd never slowed. Years of military partnership kicked in automatically. Ethan followed. Snow crunched beneath his boots. The beam from the flashlight bounced wildly through the storm. The giant cypress emerged from the darkness like a monument. Shadow stood beneath it, barking furiously, digging, pawing at the frozen ground. Trying desperately to reach something. Ethan approached. What are you? The sentence died. A sound echoed from the forest. Sharp, sudden, unmistakable. A gunshot. The noise cracked through the storm. Far enough away to avoid immediate danger. Close enough to freeze Ethan in place. Shadow spun toward the tree line, growling. The shepherd's hackles rose. Another shot followed, again distant. Again from the forest, not aimed at them. Not even close, but deliberate. Someone was there, watching, warning, or signaling. Ethan immediately scanned the darkness. Years of training took over. His breathing slowed. His awareness sharpened. The former seal returned. Every shadow became important. Every movement mattered. Yet the storm concealed everything. The forest beyond the ranch looked like a wall of blackness. Nothing moved. Nothing appeared. Only snow. Only wind. Only darkness. And somewhere inside it, another human being. Watching, the realization settled heavily inside him. The footprints, the headlights, the maintained supplies, Garrett's sudden appearance, the photographs, the journals. Now this, none of it was random. Someone had an interest in Black Hollow Ranch, a serious interest. Shadow continued growling toward the trees. The dog had completely forgotten the storm, forgotten the cold, forgotten everything except the unseen presence in the darkness. Another flash of lightning illuminated the property. For a brief instant, Ethan saw the forest clearly, the ridgeline, the snow-covered trees, the shadows. Then darkness returned, but he thought he saw something. A figure, maybe, standing between the pines, watching. Then gone. The lightning vanished too quickly to confirm. The moment lasted less than a second, yet Ethan trusted his instincts. Someone had been there. Someone had wanted him to know it. A third sound echoed through the valley. Not a gunshot this time. An engine, distant, retreating, moving away through the mountains. The visitor was leaving. The storm swallowed the noise almost immediately. Silence returned. At least the mountain version of silence. Wind, snow, darkness. Shadow remained focused on the forest. Several minutes passed before the dog finally relaxed. Slightly. Only slightly. Ethan crouched beside him. The shepherd's body still trembled with adrenaline. "What were you trying to show me?" Shadow turned toward the cypress, then back toward the woods, then toward the tree again. The message was obvious. Whatever mattered was here, near the cypress, near the ground, near whatever the dog had been trying to dig toward. Ethan looked down. The snow already covered most of Shadow's excavation. Only a shallow hole remained visible. Not enough to reveal anything, but enough to deepen the mystery. The wind intensified again. The storm wasn't finished. Reluctantly, Ethan guided Shadow back toward the cabin. The shepherd obeyed, though he repeatedly looked over his shoulder, back toward the tree, back toward the darkness, back toward the secret hidden somewhere beneath the frozen earth. Hours later, long after midnight, Ethan sat beside the fireplace, unable to sleep. The storm still raged outside. Shadow rested nearby. Yet neither of them truly relaxed. Someone had been in those woods. Someone had fired those shots. Someone knew enough about Black Hollow Ranch to risk coming here during a blizzard. And somewhere beneath the roots of an ancient cypress tree, something important enough to attract strangers remained hidden. The mystery was no longer theoretical. It was real, dangerously real. And for the first time since arriving at the ranch, Ethan understood that he wasn't simply uncovering a family secret. He was walking directly into a conflict that had been waiting for decades. Morning arrived beneath a sky the color of steel. The storm had finally passed. Fresh snow covered Black Hollow Ranch in a smooth, unbroken blanket of white. The mountains stood silent beneath the pale winter sun. Everything looked peaceful, but Ethan knew better. Peace and safety were not the same thing. He stepped onto the porch with a mug of coffee and scanned the property. The cypress tree stood motionless in the center of the ranch. Ancient, patient, almost waiting. Shadow pushed past him before he could finish his first sip. The shepherd trotted directly toward the tree. Again. Always the tree. Ethan watched from the porch. The dog circled the trunk, sniffed, paused, then began digging. Snow flew behind him. His front paws worked furiously against the frozen earth. The determination was unlike anything Ethan had seen since their deployment years. Whatever Shadow believed was down there, he was absolutely convinced, and nothing would stop him. "You're stubborn, you know that?" Shadow ignored him. The digging continued. Ethan smiled despite himself. For the first time in days, the tension eased slightly. Watching Shadow work reminded him of better years. Years before hospital bills, before funerals, before sleeping in a truck, back when the world still made sense. A memory surfaced. Afghanistan, a dusty village hidden among rocky hills. Shadow had refused to leave a particular wall. The dog had barked relentlessly for nearly 20 minutes. Several soldiers had thought the shepherd was confused. Ethan hadn't. The dog had eventually uncovered a hidden weapons cache buried beneath loose stone. Lives had been saved because Shadow trusted his instincts. That memory stayed with Ethan as he watched the shepherd digging beneath the cypress. Shadow wasn't guessing. He never guessed. By noon, Ethan decided to help. He grabbed a shovel from the shed and walked toward the tree. The frozen ground resisted every strike. Roots twisted through the earth beneath the surface. Whatever was hidden down there had been concealed well. Hours passed. They made little progress. Eventually, Ethan leaned against the shovel and laughed. "Maybe you're crazier than I am." Shadow sat beside the growing hole, panting, watching, waiting. Then suddenly the shepherd stood. His ears rose. The dog's entire posture changed, alert, focused, concerned. Ethan noticed immediately. "What is it?" Shadow wasn't looking toward the forest this time. He was staring at the ground, at a spot roughly 20 feet away from where they had been digging. The shepherd walked slowly toward it, sniffed, then pawed lightly at the snow. Once, twice, 3 times, Ethan followed. At first he saw nothing unusual. Then the sunlight hit something metallic, a chain, partially hidden beneath the snow. His stomach tightened. He crouched carefully. The chain disappeared into the ground, attached to something that absolutely did not belong on an abandoned ranch. Military training returned instantly. Every instinct screamed caution. "Back!" Shadow immediately obeyed. Ethan brushed away more snow using the handle of the shovel. The object revealed itself a steel trap, large, old-fashioned, dangerous. The kind used decades ago for predators. But something felt wrong. The trap wasn't old. Not really. The metal showed little rust. The mechanism appeared maintained, ready, waiting. Someone had placed it recently. His pulse quickened. The realization was chilling. The trap wasn't protecting livestock. There were no livestock. It wasn't protecting property boundaries. It was positioned near the cypress tree, near the exact area Shadow kept investigating. Someone wanted to keep people away from this location. Someone expected visitors. Someone knew the secret was close. Ethan carefully disabled the mechanism, then carried the trap back toward the cabin. The discovery changed everything. This was no longer about old journals and mysterious photographs. Someone was actively protecting whatever lay beneath the cypress. Someone was still involved. That evening, Ethan studied Walter's journals again. This time he focused on dates, patterns, names. One name appeared repeatedly. Not often, but enough. Samuel Pierce. The entries never explained who Samuel was. Only references. Met with Pierce today. Pierce agrees the location remains secure. Pierce believes outside interest is growing. The name appeared across nearly 20 years, then vanished. Ethan searched online using the weak signal available near the cabin. Eventually, he found a result. Samuel Pierce, retired Army intelligence officer, deceased. 3 years earlier, the article was brief, but one sentence caught Ethan's attention. Pierce had spent much of his retirement involved in environmental resource protection initiatives throughout the western United States. Resource protection. The same phrase appeared throughout Walter's journals, the same mystery, the same hidden purpose. Outside, darkness settled across the ranch. The fire crackled softly inside the cabin. Snow reflected moonlight through the windows. Shadow rested near the hearth, at least for a while. Then suddenly the dog stood again. The shepherd limped slightly. A minor strain from hours of digging, perhaps. Yet he headed straight for the door. "Ethan?" The dog looked back, then toward the cypress, then back again. The message was obvious. "Come with me," Ethan sighed. One more trip, they stepped outside. The cold struck immediately. The moon illuminated the property in silver light. Everything appeared frozen, still, silent. The cypress towered above them. Shadow moved toward it without hesitation. Halfway there, the dog stopped. His ears flattened. A low growl emerged from deep in his chest. Then it happened. A sharp, metallic snap shattered the silence. Shadow yelped. The sound ripped through Ethan like electricity. "Shadow!" The shepherd collapsed into the snow. Ethan sprinted forward, his heart pounding. His boots crashed through drifts as he reached the dog. Another trap, hidden, better concealed than the first. The steel jaws had clamped around Shadow's front leg. Not severe enough to crush, but painful, very painful. The shepherd struggled, growling, not at Ethan, at the trap, at the unseen enemy who had placed it there. Ethan dropped to his knees. "It's okay, buddy." The dog trusted him instantly. Years of partnership, years of loyalty, years of surviving together. Shadow stopped fighting, breathing heavily, waiting. Ethan carefully released the mechanism. The trap opened. The shepherd pulled free. Blood stained the snow. Not much, but enough. The sight twisted something inside Ethan's chest. Anger, pure anger, not because of the injury, because of what it meant. The first trap could have been dismissed as coincidence. An old relic, forgotten. This one could not. It had been placed recently, deliberately, near the exact area Shadow kept investigating. Someone knew. Someone was watching. Someone wanted to stop them. Ethan lifted the shepherd into his arms. The dog weighed nearly 80 pounds. Years ago, the carry would have been easy. At 62, it hurt. He didn't care. Step by step, he carried Shadow back to the cabin, back to safety, back to warmth. Inside, Ethan cleaned the wound carefully. The injury wasn't life-threatening. A deep bruise, several cuts, painful, but survivable. Shadow never complained, never whined. The old shepherd simply lay beside the fire while Ethan worked. The same way he had once remained calm while medics treated wounds overseas. A soldier to the end. Hours later, the bandage was secured. The fire burned low. Outside, the mountains slept beneath moonlight. Inside, Ethan sat beside Shadow, one hand resting gently on the dog's shoulder. The room remained silent for a long time. Then Ethan looked toward the window, toward the distant silhouette of the cypress tree. The traps had answered an important question. Someone was afraid. Afraid enough to place obstacles. Afraid enough to patrol the ranch. Afraid enough to fire warning shots during a storm. Whatever lay beneath that tree mattered, more than money, more than property, more than old family secrets. And Shadow had almost paid the price for finding it. The shepherd lifted his head slightly. Their eyes met. Ethan smiled, a tired smile, a grateful one. "You still want to go back, don't you?" Shadow's tail thumped once against the floor, despite the pain, despite the injury, despite everything. The dog hadn't given up, not even close, and neither had Ethan. Because somewhere beneath the roots of that ancient cypress tree, a secret had survived for decades. And now, for the first time, it was finally within reach. The next morning arrived clear and cold. Sunlight spilled across the mountains like liquid gold. Fresh snow glittered beneath the sky. Everything looked peaceful. But Ethan barely noticed. His attention remained fixed on Shadow. The shepherd lay beside the fireplace, resting his injured leg. The swelling had gone down overnight. The bandage remained clean. Most importantly, the old dog's eyes were bright, alert, determined. The same determination Ethan had seen during missions years ago. The same refusal to quit. "You should be resting." Shadow thumped his tail, then immediately struggled to his feet. Ethan laughed despite himself. "Yeah, I figured you'd say that." After breakfast, Ethan carefully replaced the bandage and checked the injury again. The shepherd tolerated the examination patiently. But the moment Ethan stood up, Shadow limped toward the door, toward the cypress, again. Always the tree. The message couldn't have been clearer. Whatever secret waited beneath those roots mattered more to the dog than pain, more than comfort, more than caution. And Ethan had learned long ago to trust Shadow's instincts, so they went. The walk across the snow-covered ranch was slow. Shadow favored his injured leg but refused assistance. The cypress stood beneath the morning sky, like an ancient guardian. Its massive branches stretched across the frozen landscape, watching, waiting, as though it had been waiting for this day. For them. When they reached the tree, Shadow immediately moved toward the same spot he had investigated repeatedly. The same patch of ground, the same circle of roots, the same location where someone had placed traps. Ethan studied the area carefully. The previous day's snow had partially melted beneath direct sunlight. The ground showed signs of disturbance, not recent, old, very old. And beneath one exposed root, something caught his eye. A piece of metal, small, almost invisible. His pulse quickened. He knelt, used a gloved hand to brush away dirt and ice. More metal appeared. Not a trap, not debris, something larger, something buried. "Easy, buddy." Shadow sat nearby, watching, waiting. Ethan returned to the cabin for tools, a shovel, a pry bar, work gloves. The next several hours became a battle against frozen earth. The roots made digging difficult. The ground resisted every effort, yet slowly the shape beneath emerged. Steel flat, rectangular, a container. Buried deep beneath the tree, protected by decades of roots, protected by time, protected by Walter. Ethan's heart pounded. This was it. The reason for the journals. The reason for the monthly visits. The reason strangers still watched the ranch. The reason Shadow refused to quit. The steel container measured roughly 3 feet long. Military style, weatherproof, heavy, very heavy. Ethan finally freed it from the surrounding earth and dragged it into the open. The metal surface showed age but little corrosion. Someone had preserved it carefully. The lock remained intact, and attached to the latch was something unexpected. A small brass tag, engraved with 2 words for Ethan. He froze. For Ethan. Not for an heir, not for family, not for anyone else, for Ethan. The realization struck him harder than he expected. Walter had known, years ago, maybe decades ago. Somehow Walter had known this day would come. Shadow nudged the container gently with his nose, almost impatient, as if urging him forward. Ethan examined the lock, then remembered something, the rusted key. The same key given to him during the estate's settlement. The same key his relatives had mocked. The same key nobody wanted. His hands trembled slightly as he retrieved it from his pocket. The key slid into the lock. Perfect fit. For a moment he simply stared, then turned it. Click. The sound echoed through the mountain air. The lock released. Silence followed. Even the wind seemed to pause. Ethan slowly lifted the lid. Inside sat several neatly organized items. Waterproof document folders, maps, photographs, government seals, property records, and one thick envelope. The envelope rested on top, cream-colored, protected inside plastic. His name appeared across the front in bold handwriting. Ethan Calloway. The handwriting belonged to Walter. Ethan recognized it instantly. The old man's steady penmanship. The same handwriting that filled the journals. The same handwriting he remembered from birthday cards long ago. For several moments he couldn't move. The mountains disappeared. The ranch disappeared. Everything narrowed to that envelope. Because after losing his wife, after losing his career, after losing nearly everything, someone had left a message specifically for him. Shadow sat quietly beside him. The dog seemed to understand the importance of the moment, as though he knew this was why they had come, why they had endured everything. Ethan finally opened the envelope. The letter inside contained several pages. The first line immediately stole his breath. "If you're reading this, then Shadow found it." Ethan stared. A stunned laugh escaped him. Walter had known. Somehow he had known. The old man had anticipated everything. His eyes continued scanning the page. The letter explained that Walter had watched Ethan's military career from afar for years. Every deployment, every promotion, every sacrifice. Walter had been proud. More proud than he had ever said aloud. The words struck Ethan like physical blows. Then the letter shifted. The mystery finally began unraveling. Walter described discovering something beneath Black Hollow Ranch decades earlier. Not gold, not oil, not gemstones. Water, a massive underground freshwater reserve. Pure, protected, extraordinarily valuable. A geological treasure hidden beneath the mountains. Walter had spent years working with hydrologists, environmental experts, and government agencies. Testing, mapping, protecting. The reserve stretched far beyond the ranch itself. Its value measured not in thousands, not even millions, but in future generations, in survival, in life. Ethan looked up from the letter. The mountains suddenly appeared different. The ranch appeared different. Everything changed. Walter continued explaining. For decades, corporations had attempted to acquire surrounding properties. Several companies knew fragments of the truth. None knew the full picture. Walter had deliberately kept the secret hidden, protected, waiting. Then Ethan reached the final pages and discovered the most surprising revelation of all. The reserve wasn't the true inheritance. The water rights alone represented enormous wealth. But that wasn't why Walter had left the ranch to him. Walter wrote, "The water matters, but not as much as you do." Ethan stopped breathing. His vision blurred. The words continued. "You spent your life protecting people you'll never meet. You carried burdens most men couldn't imagine. If you're reading this, life probably wasn't kind to you after you came home. I hoped it would be, but I prepared for the possibility that it wouldn't. That's why this ranch belongs to you. Not because you need money, because you need a place. A place that can protect you the way you've protected others. A place where good men can heal. A place where you can finally come home." The mountains disappeared behind tears. Ethan lowered the letter. For a long moment, he simply sat there beneath the cypress tree, unable to move, unable to speak. The cold no longer mattered. The mystery no longer mattered. The wealth no longer mattered. For the first time since losing his wife, someone had seen him, truly seen him. Not as a veteran, not as a burden, not as a failure, not as a homeless man sleeping in a truck, but as Ethan. A man who mattered. Shadow rested his head gently against Ethan's arm. The familiar gesture broke whatever remained of his defenses. A tear slipped down his cheek. Then another. The old shepherd remained beside him, silent, loyal, steady, just as he always had been. The mountain wind moved softly through the branches above. The ancient cypress swayed, and beneath its roots, the greatest secret of Black Hollow Ranch had finally emerged. Not buried treasure, not hidden gold, not forgotten riches, a gift, a purpose, a future, and the first piece of a legacy Walter had spent decades protecting. The wind moved gently through the branches above. Snow drifted from the cypress like falling feathers. For a long time, Ethan remained seated beside the open steel container. The letter rested in his hands. Shadow sat beside him. Neither moved, neither spoke. The mountains seemed to understand that something sacred had happened beneath the ancient tree. The world felt quieter somehow, softer. The kind of silence that arrives after a truth has finally been spoken. Ethan looked down at Walter's letter again, his vision blurred, not from the cold, not from exhaustion, from emotion he had spent years trying not to feel. The pages trembled slightly in his hands. Walter's words continued. and each sentence seemed aimed directly at places Ethan had spent years hiding from himself. I know what war does to good men. I know what comes home with them. The uniforms come off, the medals get packed away, the world moves on. But some battles stay. Ethan swallowed hard. The mountain air suddenly felt thin. His eyes drifted toward the horizon, toward the snow-covered peaks stretching endlessly across Colorado. War. The word alone carried weight. He remembered things he rarely allowed himself to revisit. The sound of helicopters at dawn, the smell of dust and diesel, the faces of men who never came home, the names. Always the names. Certain memories never truly left, they simply waited. Walter's letter continued. If you blame yourself for things you couldn't control, you're not alone. I've done it too. Most men do. But guilt is a poor companion, and a terrible home. The words struck harder than Ethan expected, because they were true, painfully true. For years he had carried invisible burdens, friends lost during deployments, decisions made under impossible circumstances, moments he replayed endlessly, always asking the same questions. What if? What could I have done differently? Could I have saved them? No therapist had ever managed to reach those places completely. No medication had fully silenced them. But somehow Walter's simple words slipped past every defense. Because they came without judgment, only understanding. Shadow rested his head on Ethan's knee. The familiar pressure grounded him. The shepherd had been there for many of those memories, many of those battles, many of those losses. The dog carried scars too, not all of them visible. Ethan scratched behind Shadow's ears. You knew, didn't you? Shadow blinked slowly. Content, present, steady. The way he had always been. Ethan smiled faintly through damp eyes, then returned to the letter. The next section stopped him cold. I followed your career, every deployment, every promotion, every commendation. The newspapers never reported much, but old friends still knew people, and people talk. I was proud of you every single day. Ethan froze. His chest tightened, proud. Such a simple word, yet it landed harder than any medal, harder than any award, harder than any recognition he'd ever received. Because Walter had never said it, not once. Not when Ethan enlisted. Not after Bud's training. Not after becoming a SEAL. Not after returning from combat. The old man had always been quiet, reserved, difficult to read. And now, years later, Ethan discovered that Walter had been watching the entire time. Watching, supporting, believing. The realization broke something open inside him. A memory surfaced. Summer. 25 years earlier. A family barbecue. Ethan had just returned from deployment. Walter had sat beside him for nearly an hour. The two men barely spoke. Mostly they watched the sunset. At the time, Ethan thought the silence meant distance. Now he wondered if it had meant something else entirely. Perhaps Walter simply hadn't known how to say the things that mattered. The same way Ethan often didn't. The same way many men didn't. His eyes moved to the next page, and there he found the passage that finally shattered him. When your wife passed away, I wanted to call. I wanted to drive to wherever you were and sit beside you. But by then my health wasn't what it used to be. So I did the only thing I knew how to do. I made sure Black Hollow would be waiting. Waiting. The word lingered. Walter had known. He had known about Claire, known about her illness, known about her death, known about the collapse that followed. Claire. Even now the name hurt. The grief never vanished. It simply changed shape. The memory of her smile appeared instantly. The way she laughed. The way she always made coffee too strong. The way she somehow understood Ethan's silences. She had been his safe place, his home. And when she died, something inside him had collapsed. The years afterward felt blurry. Medical bills, isolation, pisty worsening, the truck, the endless drifting, surviving rather than living. Walter had seen all of it, from a distance, and prepared this place anyway. Prepared a future Ethan didn't even know existed. The letter continued. If you're reading this beneath that tree, then you made it, and that's enough. You don't need to prove anything anymore. Not to me. Not to anyone. The tears came without warning. One moment Ethan was reading. The next he couldn't see the page. He lowered the letter, bent forward, and finally let himself feel everything. The grief, the exhaustion, the loneliness, the years of carrying pain alone, the years of pretending he was fine, the years of believing nobody truly understood. The tears came hard, silent at first, then heavier, raw, honest, human. The mountains witnessed it all. The cypress tree stood above him, the same tree Walter had protected for decades, the same tree Shadow had refused to abandon, the same tree that had led him here. Shadow moved closer. The old shepherd carefully rested his head in Ethan's lap. The gesture was simple, yet it carried the weight of a lifetime. The dog asked for nothing, expected nothing. He simply stayed, as he always had, beside him, through deployments, through nightmares, through loss, through everything. Ethan wrapped an arm around Shadow's neck. For a long time neither moved. The afternoon slowly faded. Sunlight shifted across the snow. The mountains turned gold, then orange, then crimson. Eventually Ethan wiped his eyes and looked back into the steel container. Several documents remained unread. Maps, geological surveys, trust paperwork, legal records, yet somehow none of it felt urgent anymore. The treasure wasn't the water reserve. Not really. The treasure wasn't the value of the ranch, or the future income, or the hidden resource beneath the mountains. The treasure was the letter. Proof. Proof that someone had understood him. Proof that someone had cared. Proof that his life had mattered. That he had mattered. The realization settled deep inside him. War had taken many things. He had taken more. Grief had taken almost everything that remained. But Walter had left him something stronger than money. Purpose. A reason to keep moving forward. A reason to build something instead of merely surviving. The sun disappeared behind the mountains. Evening settled across Black Hollow Ranch. Ethan carefully folded the letter, then placed it back inside the protective sleeve. Not because he was finished reading it, because he knew he would read it again. Many times, for years, the words would remain, just like Walter intended. As he closed the steel container, Ethan noticed one final handwritten note attached to the inside lid, smaller than the others, easy to miss. It contained only a single sentence. Take care of the place. It will take care of you. Ethan stared at those words, then looked toward the ranch, the cabin, the mountains, the forest, the ancient cypress. For the first time since losing Claire, for the first time in years, for the first time he could remember, the future didn't look empty, and somewhere in the growing darkness beyond the ranch, unseen eyes were still watching, still waiting, still searching for the secret Walter had hidden. But tonight none of that mattered, because for one brief moment beneath the cypress tree, Ethan felt something he thought he had lost forever. He felt loved, and beside him, Shadow quietly kept watch as the first stars appeared over Black Hollow Ranch. For the first time in years, Ethan slept peacefully. Not perfectly. The memories still existed. The scars still remained. But something inside him had shifted. Walter's letter had done what therapy, medication, and time had struggled to accomplish. It had given him a reason to believe that his story wasn't over. Morning sunlight spilled across the cabin windows. The mountains glowed beneath fresh snow. Shadow was already awake. The old shepherd sat near the front door, watching the ranch. Always watching. Ethan smiled. Back on duty already? Shadow's tail tapped the floor. The dog seemed stronger. The injury still slowed him slightly, but his spirit remained untouched. After breakfast, Ethan spread Walter's documents across the kitchen table. This time he focused on the files he hadn't fully examined. Maps, survey reports, legal records, environmental assessments. The deeper he read, the clearer the picture became. Walter had spent decades building layers of protection around Black Hollow Ranch. Not just for the water reserve, for the land itself, for the future, and apparently for Ethan. One folder contained correspondence between Walter and several environmental agencies. Another included geological reports confirming the extraordinary size of the underground freshwater reserve. A third folder held something far more interesting: names, companies, land acquisition attempts, failed negotiations, offers, counteroffers, decades of corporate interest. One name appeared repeatedly: Voss Development. Ethan stared. Garrett Voss, the businessman who had appeared almost immediately after Ethan arrived. Walter had documented him for years. The earliest reference dated back nearly 12 years. The most recent was only 6 months old. Walter had been tracking him, watching him. The realization sent a chill through Ethan. Garrett hadn't discovered the ranch recently. He'd been pursuing it for years, maybe longer. Shadow suddenly growled, low, focused. Ethan looked up. The dog stood near the window, watching the driveway. A moment later, Ethan heard it too. Engines, more than one, approaching. His pulse quickened. The sound grew louder. Then 2 black SUVs appeared beyond the gate, new, expensive, out of place. The vehicles rolled slowly up the snow-covered road. Ethan moved toward the porch. Shadow followed immediately. The shepherd positioned himself beside Ethan's leg, protective, ready. The SUVs stopped. Garrett Voss stepped out of the lead vehicle. 2 other men emerged behind him. Neither appeared friendly. Neither appeared interested in scenery. Garrett smiled as he approached. The same polished smile. The same carefully controlled confidence. "Mr. Calloway." Ethan remained silent. Garrett glanced toward the cabin, then toward the cypress tree, then back toward Ethan. A quick look, almost subconscious, but Ethan noticed. The tree mattered. Garrett couldn't hide it. "What do you want?" Garrett sighed dramatically. "I was hoping we could discuss business." "We already did. Then perhaps we should discuss it again." Shadow growled softly. The businessman glanced at the dog. Something about the shepherd made him uncomfortable. "Good." Garrett folded his hands. "The offer I made was generous. I'm not selling. Everyone sells eventually." The sentence lingered. Not exactly a threat, not exactly a joke. Something in between. Ethan's expression hardened. "I think we're done." For the first time, Garrett's smile disappeared. Only for a moment, but long enough. The mask slipped, and beneath it Ethan saw something else. Frustration, desperation, maybe even fear. Garrett recovered quickly. "You should review all your options." "I have. The mountains can be difficult." Ethan said nothing. "The winters are harsh." Still nothing. "The property requires significant resources." Silence. Garrett finally nodded. "As you wish." He turned and walked back toward the SUVs. But before entering, he looked once more toward the cypress tree. The glance lasted less than a second, yet it confirmed everything. Garrett wasn't interested in the ranch. He was interested in whatever the ranch contained. Minutes later, the vehicles disappeared down the mountain road. Shadow continued staring long after they vanished. The old shepherd clearly didn't trust them. Neither did Ethan. By afternoon, he made a decision. He drove into town. Not for supplies, for answers. Durango bustled with winter activity. Tourists filled the sidewalks. Local businesses hummed with life. The contrast to Black Hollow Ranch felt enormous. Ethan headed directly to a small law office whose name appeared repeatedly in Walter's records. Harrison and Blake. The attorney who greeted him was elderly, sharp-eyed, and apparently unsurprised. "You must be Ethan." Ethan stopped. "You knew I'd come?" The attorney smiled faintly. "Your grandfather expected it." Another piece of Walter's planning. Another step prepared years in advance. The attorney invited him inside. For nearly 2 hours they reviewed documents, contracts, environmental filings, protected water rights, corporate challenges. The story became clearer with every page. Garrett Voss had spent years quietly acquiring land surrounding portions of the reserve. Piece by piece, property by property, some legal, some questionable. Several investigations had examined his practices. None had successfully stopped him. Walter apparently believed Garrett's ultimate goal had always been Black Hollow Ranch, the heart of the reserve, the most valuable piece. The attorney slid a folder across the desk. Ethan opened it. Inside were photographs, financial records, property transfers, internal communications, evidence, lots of it. Your grandfather collected everything. Ethan flipped through the pages. The scope surprised him. Walter hadn't simply protected the ranch. He had been building a case, preparing, waiting. The attorney leaned forward. He knew someday someone might need this. Someone you, the words settled heavily again. Always the same answer. You. By the time Ethan returned to the ranch, evening had arrived. Clouds gathered over the mountains. Snow drifted through the fading light. Shadow met him at the porch, tail wagging, relieved. The sight warmed Ethan more than he expected. The old dog had become more than a companion, more than a service animal, more than a partner. He was family. Inside the cabin, Ethan organized the new evidence beside Walter's files. The table filled quickly. Maps, reports, photographs, records. The picture now seemed unmistakable. Garrett had spent years searching for the same secret Walter had protected. And he wasn't likely to walk away simply because Ethan said no. Night settled across the ranch. The fire crackled softly. Wind brushed against the cabin walls. For a brief moment, everything seemed calm. Then a sound shattered the silence. Glass breaking. The crash echoed from the rear of the cabin. Shadow exploded into motion. The shepherd sprinted toward the noise, growling, barking. Ethan followed instantly. Years of military reflexes taking over. By the time he reached the back room, the intruder was already fleeing. A dark figure disappeared through the broken window. Fast, desperate. Snow scattered beneath running boots. Shadow lunged toward the opening, but Ethan stopped him. Stay. The command came automatically. The old shepherd obeyed, though every instinct clearly urged him to pursue. Ethan stepped outside. The figure vanished into the darkness. Gone, but not before leaving something behind. A dropped flashlight. Cheap, disposable, and proof. Someone had entered the cabin. Someone had targeted Walter's files. Someone knew the secret was no longer hidden. Back inside, Ethan examined the room. Several folders had been disturbed. Nothing appeared missing. The intruder hadn't had enough time, but the message was clear. The hunters were no longer watching from a distance. They were moving, actively, aggressively. The conflict Walter anticipated had finally arrived. Shadow stood beside the broken window, growling softly toward the darkness beyond. The old shepherd's ears remained fixed on the forest, listening, waiting, ready. Ethan placed a hand on the dog's shoulder. Together they stared into the snowy night. Somewhere out there, Garrett Voss had realized the secret was no longer buried, and that realization would make him dangerous, very dangerous. Because men who spend years chasing something rarely stop when they're close to finding it, and Black Hollow Ranch was about to become a battlefield. The confrontation came 3 days later, not with gunfire, not with violence, but with exposure, the kind that destroys carefully built lies. The kind Walter had been preparing for all along. Snow covered the mountains when Ethan received the call. He stood on the porch, watching dawn paint the peaks gold while Shadow rested beside him. The old shepherd's injured leg was improving. The limp remained, but the fire in his eyes had returned completely. The phone rang. "Attorney Harrison." Ethan answered immediately. "We have movement." Those 3 words changed everything. What happened? The state investigators reviewed the files. Ethan remained silent. "The evidence Walter collected is stronger than we realized." A pause. "They've opened a formal inquiry into several land acquisitions connected to Garrett Voss." The mountain air felt suddenly lighter, not because the battle was over, because it had finally begun moving in the right direction. Over the next week, events unfolded rapidly. Investigators arrived in Durango. Property records were reviewed. Financial transactions were examined. Several former employees of Voss Development agreed to cooperate. Years of hidden dealings began surfacing, not dramatic conspiracies, not movie-style corruption, something far more believable. Greed, pressure, manipulation. Small dishonest choices repeated over many years, the kind of choices that eventually become impossible to hide. Ethan remained mostly at the ranch. That was exactly where he wanted to be. Exactly where Walter intended him to be. Each morning he walked the property with Shadow. Each evening he sat beneath the cypress tree, reading portions of Walter's journals. The ranch felt different now. Not mysterious, not threatening. Alive, purposeful, as if it had finally remembered what it was meant to become. Then came the second wave, his relatives. The moment news began spreading about the water reserve, family members started calling. First a cousin, then another, then an uncle. Finally the same relatives who had laughed during the estate settlement. The same people who had dismissed Black Hollow Ranch as worthless. Now they wanted conversations, explanations, meetings. One snowy afternoon, 3 SUVs climbed the mountain road. Ethan recognized them immediately. Family. Shadow did too. The shepherd stood beside the porch, alert but calm. The visitors stepped out awkwardly. The confidence they once carried seemed diminished. Reality had a way of doing that. His cousin Bradley approached first. The same man who had mocked the ranch. The same man who had compared it unfavorably to Ethan's truck. Now his smile looked forced. Ethan. Ethan nodded. Bradley looked around the property. The mountains, the cabin, the cypress, the land he once considered worthless. We should probably talk. We're talking. Bradley laughed nervously. A few other relatives exchanged uncomfortable looks. No one seemed eager to begin. Finally, his cousin Rachel spoke. We didn't know. Ethan said nothing. We honestly didn't know what was here. The statement was true, yet it changed nothing. They hadn't cared enough to find out. That was the real issue, not ignorance, indifference. Bradley cleared his throat. The family's wondering if maybe the estate division should be revisited. There it was. The real reason for the visit. Not reconciliation, not concern, money, again. The same thing Walter predicted. The same thing Ethan had expected. For a moment nobody spoke. Wind moved through the trees. Snow drifted from the cypress branches. The mountains watched silently. Then Ethan surprised even himself. Because he wasn't angry. Months earlier he might have been. Years earlier definitely now. Mostly tired. Tired of resentment. Tired of bitterness. Tired of carrying things that no longer deserved space inside him. He looked toward the ranch, then toward Shadow, then back at his relatives. This place isn't about money, Bradley blinked. What? It never was. The confusion on their faces was almost painful, because they genuinely didn't understand. Ethan continued. My grandfather spent decades protecting this ranch. He pointed toward the cypress. Not because it was valuable. Another pause. Because he believed it could help people. The relatives exchanged looks. Still confused, still thinking in numbers, property values, water rights, future profits. They couldn't see what Ethan now saw clearly. The ranch wasn't an inheritance. It was a responsibility. A purpose. Something far bigger than ownership. Rachel stepped forward. You're really not interested in discussing a settlement? Ethan smiled softly. No. The answer landed with surprising finality. Not hostile. Not defensive. Simply complete. The conversation ended there. One by one they returned to their vehicles. No arguments, no shouting, no dramatic confrontation. Just disappointment. The quiet disappointment that comes when people realize they arrived too late. Ethan watched them leave. Shadow sat beside him. The old shepherd's tail brushed lightly against the snow. When the vehicles disappeared around the mountain bend, Ethan felt something unexpected. Relief, not victory. Relief, because he no longer needed approval. No longer needed recognition. No longer needed anyone to validate what Walter already had. That evening another call arrived. Attorney Harrison again. This time, his voice sounded different, satisfied. "It's finished." Ethan leaned back in his chair. "What is, Garrett Voss?" "Silence," then the attorney explained. "Multiple investigations, financial violations, fraud allegations, improper acquisitions. The details hardly mattered. The result did. Voss Development was collapsing. Investors were pulling away. Projects were frozen. The empire Garrett spent years building was coming apart. Not because Ethan destroyed it, because truth finally caught up with it. Walter's evidence had simply accelerated the process. After the call ended, Ethan walked outside. Night covered the ranch. Stars filled the Colorado sky. The cypress stood silhouetted against the heavens. Shadow followed beside him. Together they crossed the snow-covered field. The old shepherd's limp was barely noticeable now. When they reached the tree, Ethan rested a hand against the ancient trunk. The bark felt rough, solid, enduring. Like Walter himself. Like all the people who quietly do the right thing even when nobody notices. The ranch had survived. The secret had survived. And somehow so had Ethan. For years he believed his life had narrowed into loss. Claire's death, the PSD, the loneliness, the truck, the endless drifting. Now those years felt different, not erased. Nothing erased them, but transformed. Part of a longer story. A story that hadn't ended after all. Shadow settled beneath the tree. The same place where everything changed. The same place where Walter's letter waited. The same place where purpose had been rediscovered. Ethan sat beside him. The mountains stretched endlessly around them. Silent, peaceful, whole. For a long time neither moved, neither needed to. Because after months of mystery, after danger, after loss, after answers, something rare had finally arrived, stillness. And for the first time in many years, Ethan welcomed it. Winter passed slowly across the San Juan Mountains. The deep snow that had buried Black Hollow Ranch began to retreat from the hillsides. Patches of earth appeared. Streams awakened beneath melting ice. The long silence of winter gave way to the first signs of spring. Life returned, and so did Ethan. The transformation happened gradually, the way healing often does. Not in a dramatic moment, not with a sudden realization, but one quiet day after another. One morning at a time. One decision at a time. The ranch became his routine, his purpose, his mission. Every sunrise found Ethan and Shadow walking the property together. The old German shepherd still carried a slight limp from the trap injury. But he never complained, never slowed down for long, never stopped working, because in Shadow's mind he still had a job. Protect the ranch, protect Ethan, stand watch. The same duty he had carried through deserts and mountains half a world away. One morning in April, Ethan stood beneath the cypress tree with a notebook in his hands. Walter's letter rested inside the front cover. He had read it dozens of times, perhaps hundreds. Each reading revealed something new, something deeper, something he had missed before. The words no longer felt like a goodbye, they felt like instructions. A roadmap. A responsibility. Take care of the place. It will take care of you. Walter had been right. The ranch was healing him. The mountains were healing him. The work was healing him. Even the silence was healing him. But the greatest surprise was what happened next. One afternoon, Ethan received an email from a veterans support organization in Denver. Then another, and another. Word had spread. A former Navy SEAL living on a mountain ranch. A man rebuilding his life after loss. A military working dog who had become a symbol of loyalty and resilience. People were talking, not because Ethan wanted attention, because his story resonated. Other veterans understood. Families understood. Widows understood. People struggling through invisible battles understood. A month later, the first visitor arrived. A Marine Corps veteran named Lucas, 47 years old, divorced, battling severe PTSD, living alone, barely holding his life together. He stayed for 3 days, mostly walking the ranch, mostly sitting quietly, mostly spending time with Shadow. The old shepherd seemed to know exactly what people needed. He would sit beside them without demanding anything, without judging, without asking questions, simply present. By the second evening, Lucas was laughing, a genuine laugh, the first he'd experienced in months, maybe years. When he left, he shook Ethan's hand, then knelt beside Shadow. "Thanks, partner." Shadow wagged his tail. Lucas wiped away tears before driving away. 3 weeks later, another veteran arrived. Then another. Then another. Soon, Ethan realized something important. Walter hadn't simply left him a ranch. He had left him a place capable of helping others. The freshwater reserve generated income through the carefully managed agreement Walter had envisioned. The trust remained strong. The ranch remained protected, and Ethan finally understood what he wanted to do with it. By summer, construction began. Nothing extravagant, nothing flashy. A few small cabins, a community lodge, walking trails through the forest, a training area for retired service dogs, a counseling center overlooking the mountains. Simple, practical, purposeful. The kind of place veterans would actually use. The kind of place Ethan himself would have needed years earlier. The project took shape month by month. Volunteers arrived. Local contractors donated time. Veterans from across Colorado offered help. People believed in the mission because they understood it. The retreat officially opened the following spring. The name was simple: Calloway Ridge Veterans Retreat. The first group included 8 veterans, different ages, different branches, different stories, yet all carried familiar wounds, some visible, most invisible. The mountains welcomed them equally. The ranch welcomed them equally, and Shadow welcomed them all. The old shepherd became the heart of the retreat almost immediately. Visitors sought him out. They sat beside him, walked with him, talked to him. Sometimes they told him things they couldn't tell anyone else. Shadow listened, the way dogs do, without interruption, without judgment, without conditions. One veteran later joked that Shadow should be listed as senior staff. Ethan agreed. The title fit. By autumn, Black Hollow Ranch no longer resembled the abandoned property Ethan had inherited. The fences stood straight. The cabin had been restored beautifully. Wildflowers covered the meadows. The streams sparkled beneath clear mountain skies. Life existed everywhere, and still at the center of everything stood the ancient cypress tree, older than memory, older than secrets, older than everyone who walked beneath its branches. 1 year after finding Walter's hidden container, Ethan returned to the tree at sunset, alone. Well, almost alone. Shadow walked beside him, a little slower now, a little grayer around the muzzle, but still proud, still watchful, still Shadow. The evening light painted the mountains gold. The valley glowed beneath the fading sun. In the distance, laughter drifted across the ranch. Veterans gathered around a campfire. Stories were being shared. Friendships formed. Lives rebuilt. Exactly the future Walter had imagined. Ethan settled beneath the cypress. The same spot where everything changed. The same roots that had hidden the truth for decades. The same place where purpose had been rediscovered. He removed Walter's letter from his jacket pocket. The pages were worn now, soft at the edges. Loved, he read the final paragraphs once more, slowly, carefully, savoring every word. Then he folded the letter and looked toward the horizon. For a long moment he simply sat there, listening. The wind moved through the branches overhead. The mountains stood silent and eternal. The campfire crackled in the distance. Shadow rested beside him, and suddenly Ethan understood something profound. He had spent years believing he lost everything, his career, his wife, his future, his home. But life had been leading him here all along, to this ranch, to this purpose. To this moment he smiled, a real smile, the kind that reaches the eyes, the kind that comes from peace, not happiness, something deeper, something lasting. Shadow lifted his head. The shepherd looked toward the mountains, toward the fading light, toward the wilderness beyond Black Hollow Ranch. For a moment he looked exactly as he had during their deployments, alert, focused, standing watch. The years seemed to disappear. The scars remained, but so did the strength. Ethan rested a hand on Shadow's shoulder. "Good work, partner." Shadow leaned gently against him. The sunset deepened. Orange became crimson. Crimson became purple. The first stars appeared overhead, one by one. Just as they had on the night Ethan discovered Walter's secret. But everything felt different now, because the mystery was gone. The fear was gone. The loneliness was gone. In their place stood something stronger. Community, purpose, healing, home. Below them, laughter echoed from the campfire. Veterans sharing stories. People helping people. Lives continuing. Exactly as Walter had hoped. Exactly as Ethan now understood. He had not inherited a ranch. He had inherited a purpose. And beneath the ancient cypress tree, with his loyal K9 beside him, and a future stretching before him like the mountains themselves, Ethan finally felt something he thought he had lost forever. Home. The wind whispered softly through the branches above. Shadow kept watch. The mountains stood guard. And Black Hollow Ranch, after decades of waiting, had finally become what it was always meant to be. A place where broken people could heal. A place where loyalty lived on. A place where purpose survived. A place called home. If you believe loyalty, perseverance, and doing the right thing still matter, comment 1 below. If you've ever had to rebuild your life after loss, comment 0 and share where you're watching from. Sometimes the greatest inheritance isn't money. It's knowing you mattered to someone. And if stories like this speak to your heart, subscribe and join us for more unforgettable journeys of justice, dignity, and second chances across America.